Hello, I am Savannah. I work with Happy Dragons, and I am today's captive audience. Only jokes. I'm here just to introduce Brandon Christmann. I hope I said that right. I'm so sorry.
You got yourself.
I did. I did my best. He is a part of our team, and he is helping us today. And, he's a wealth of knowledge, so I'm going to let him introduce himself before I stutter over it.
Yeah, like Savannah said, I'm Brandon Christmann. I've been working with reptiles in private facilities for the better part of 3.5 years, and for the past half year or so, I've started to branch out on my own. Some of you may have occasionally seen some of my social media posts, kind of giving some sneak peeks behind the scenes, but I've really been putting a lot of legwork, both in growing my own collection of herps, lizards and a couple of other related critters, but also especially focusing on one of my main roles with Happy Dragons platform at the moment is enclosure and DIY enclosures and that sort of thing. Right behind me here is one of my pride and joys. It's my fully kitted out enclosure for my pair of blue tree monitors. They've been doing really well in it for a really long time. Um, Today, I just kind of wanted to have a chat about just herpeticulture and my approach to it. Because one of my main motivations for starting up a lot of what I'm starting to do in terms of it's starting with the enclosure side of things, but I'm going to get into developing a lot more systems along the line as well. But I wanted to get into today the reason that I've started along this path was because I really am interested in introducing new ways of discussing how we approach husbandry for reptiles in captivity. Um, I was kind of briefly talking with Savannah about it before we got on stream, but I kind of like to refer to one like the two sort of approaches I've seen as bottom up husbandry and top down husbandry. So with bottom up husbandry, I want a bearded dragon, right? So I go to the pet store, I select a bearded dragon I want, and then I'm like, okay, what do I need to grab from this store in order to keep this bearded dragon alive at my home? So you have the animal, and you are taking the standards that you are giving that animal at your home, and you're raising them up to what the animal needs to survive. Top-down husbandry, on the other hand, kind of goes hand in hand for me with natural history, where you know we got our blue tree monitors that live out in Indonesia, island of Batanta. What are they doing out in Batanta? Like, what are they interacting with regards to plants, with regards to like their particular niche? What's the sun doing? What kinds of animals are in their environment? Taking all of that into account, and then taking what they have access to out in the wild and what is the most reasonable form of that I can give them in my home. So that's kind of like that top down approach where it's like they have an access to a wealth of resources where they come from. Obviously, I'm not going to be able to turn my entire home into a tree monitor zoo, but sort of delineating that natural condition down into something that's sustainable and conducive to doing in your home. So that's kind of introducing the stream today a little bit. Additionally, kind of just going into in terms of when we're talking about trying to figure out what those animals are doing, like what are some good methods and practices in order to like start researching that. So
That actually really resonates with me. That's I was explaining to you earlier that was something I started passively doing quickly after I got into the hobby. With each different species I kept was kind of checking back to see what was the most naturalistic. It was kind of an inherent preference that I had. So
Mhm.
that being said, is your approach or the topic of this something that you recommend to people? Like, what are the benefits to the animal of following the natural history of an animal? Like, are there any pros or cons to doing it?
Yeah. So, I mean, a con certainly is that there's a lot more legwork involved, right? You know, especially if you're keeping a really common species, there's tons of care guides. People have been keeping them alive in captivity for a long time. We know how to do it. Um, but in my opinion, you're not getting the full view of what the animal really needs if you're just trying to learn like what its needs are at a basic level. You know, if we take a bearded dragon, for example, um, we got people that, you know, just debate all the time about what size enclosure does a bearded dragon need, right? You know, we got people that are, oh, you can keep it in something as small as a 40-gallon, or do a 4x2, or do a 4x3. But then you have people worrying about various other aspects to their enclosure once you get to a certain size. Um, you can inform a lot of that just by like researching Australia itself and researching where in Australia they're from. There's a wealth of resources online where you can go and find people go out into the Badlands and they'll have a point map on Australia of like this is where this animal is found all the way through here, and then you can go and research those locations as well and really get a good picture of what is this animal doing in the wild, because how that relates to husbandry is just because the lizard is in our home, you know, when it comes out the egg, it's got a set of expectations for I need this, this, and this is how I know how to get them. So when you're really researching that environment, creating something that they've been built for millions of years to know how to interact with. You're really teeing your animal up for success because um, we can get into it too of this when you're just kind of trying to meet the animal's basic needs without approaching it from a natural history standpoint, you open yourself up to potential issues, right? Like if we're just kind of discussing, oh, you know, this animal needs a humid hide and this and that, and you forget to keep up on making that humid hide moist, you know, all of a sudden that animal doesn't have access to that humid microclimate. Versus if we are approaching it from a natural history standpoint, and we're talking about, all right, well, let's give them a 6-inch substrate layer that we have nestled hides in that, and it's got a moisture gradient in it. All of a sudden, you know, I can not miss an enclosure for 2 or 3 days and it's fine because they've got an environment that's set up, you know, in the desert where a lot of these like arid geckos are. Um, they obviously don't get misted every day out in the wild. They're finding those human microclimates, and that's how they're surviving. So if we're doing that, it's really feeding into how that animal is built, how its brain is sort of built to observe its world. So
No, actually, that's a really interesting perspective too, because you're like, I guess, kind of in a way, the goal would be taking a piece of nature and putting it in a terrarium, right?
exactly.
So, like, facilitating those natural behaviors, because, like you, as you pointed out, like not many species are parented and taught things like how to seek water, or know when there's going to be food, or know what to do during extreme temperatures. So, like, they have that instinct, but there are some kind of caveats, I think, especially in captivity, because like for since we're talking about bearded dragons, you know, for winter for us would be summer for them, and then they could experience extreme heat waves. So when you put them in captivity, it's much smaller quarters.
Yep.
So what would your approach be for what would be your precautions for ensuring the safety of the animal, but mimicking said extremes?
Yeah, so once you've got that baseline of what has the animal experienced out in the wild, you know, um, then we talk about sort of bringing that down to a level of, okay, I have access to this kind of lighting equipment, I have access to these sorts of misting apparatuses. Um, what can I do in an enclosure to set up that proper basking array in that one spot? You know, there are certain paradigms that are going to be broadly applicable to any species. Like every species is going to need that thermal gradient, is going to need a lighting gradient, is going to need um, opportunities to hide in refuge. Um, Part of like I would obviously never tell somebody to keep a bearded dragon enclosure ambiently 110 degrees because obviously out in Australia that's about as hot as it can get for them. When they're doing that, when it gets that hot out in Australia, that's that point where they're going and hiding.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so once you have a good knowledge for what the animal is interacting with in the wild, and once you have the animal in hand, there's a lot that you can do with dialing that natural system to fit that animal's needs once you have them in hand.
Mm-hmm.
So going back to that bearded dragon example, if they're spending all day, all like the entire day under their basking light, it's probably a sign that the enclosure is not bright enough because uh, bearded dragons, unlike a lot of other creatures, or not necessarily unlike, um, bearded dragons actually inform their basking needs by like light intensity and UV intensity more so than heat. So like if they're spending all day under that basking bulb, sometimes getting burnt because like the rest of the enclosure is so dark and they're spending all that time in that bright spot, you know,
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot that you can learn both by under having a good grasp on what sort of environment the animal interacts with, as well as the animal's behavior itself once you have them in hand.
Okay. Yeah, I was just curious because that's my stance on it. Because I am personally an all or nothing type person. So I think if I want to mimic the natural habitat, then I'm also going to mimic the seasons, and like that's a part of nature, like those
Mhm.
extremes.
Yeah.
But I think it would still be perfectly reasonable to provide ideal temperatures
Yep.
or conditions, but like there is kind of like, especially just because we're using bearded dragons as the example, we'll stick with that. Like brumation's still ideal. So that I want to segue off of that, especially the changing of the year and the cycles and the seasons. Can you walk me through the process of how you find and apply the information, like for keeping? Like, assume you find a species that's totally new to you. You can even recite your past experience, how you went about learning what you could and then applying it. So, because
Yep.
I'm really interested to know, because I suck at doing research.
Yeah. Well, the first thing that I do, again, I kind of mentioned that survey map. There are several resources online, like iNaturalist. Some of them, like Australia, literally have their own dedicated site for that. Because wherever people are finding, especially adult forms of that species, that's an environment that is very conducive to that animal's survival. So, step one for me when I'm, trying to teach myself about a species by like doing research about natural history, my first order of business is where in the world specifically is that animal being found. Once you have that, um, we have a wealth of knowledge in terms of like temperature variance and weather patterns and sun patterns and such. one of my most used resources for figuring out what's going on in a native region for an animal is actually travel sites. Is a really popular one for me because people are really obviously meteorology is a really well funded field. People are have a vested interest, and when's a good time to vacation in Indonesia? And you can go and find like, oh, it's 80 degrees during on average in March, and it's 75 degrees on average in December. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so once you can start like correlating those data points with the data points that you're finding that species being found in, that's where you really start to get a good feel of like what's a good condition for that critter to be existing in. Going back to that bearded dragon example, uh, if you go into Australia, yeah, you'll have days that get up to 110 degrees. But like on average, something that I'll do is there's a couple of sites that I use that will give me like average high, average low, and average medium temperatures. So you can get a really good feel of like per that month, like what's the average like leeway that they're experiencing out there.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Pulling off of my own experiences, I follow this exact process actually for researching Tarantola chisaliae, helmeted geckos.
Hmm.
Um, they're really cute little guys.
Those are the ones that look really
they're the
grumpy,
same
right?
they're the same family as crocodile geckos or Moorish geckos, if you're familiar with those.
I think
Uh,
so.
but they're kind of endemic to a really weird region. They come from coastal Morocco exclusively. So you find a bunch of really weird things with that region, where it's like it's got a specific temperature pattern throughout the year. Um, Morocco, like the rest of the country, is actually extremely parched, but all the helmeted geckos are right along the coastline, and they're actually getting really like decently high humidity values throughout the year. Like they're usually hovering around. I found that's the best success for them around like 60% humidity. So um, when I because like I inherited the project at a facility that I used to work at, and they were having like little to no success with them, keeping them a certain way. And I just basically went and completely readdressed the husbandry process for them. And like I said, kind of starting from that natural history standpoint of like where do they come from, what are they interacting with out in the wild. And I harp on like temperature and humidity because those are like the basics. But once you have that knowledge of like, well, where does this species live in the wild, um, you can really start to get a good picture for the kind of region that that animal's in. Going back to those helmeted geckos, if you just heard that they live in Morocco, you'd think that they live in a parched desert. But where they actually basically live is in like shrubs along the coastline of Morocco. And they're getting a lot of that humidity rolling in from the ocean. So they're still living in relatively dry, sandy substrate, but they have a lot of ambient air humidity. So,
I actually had no idea they were like a coastal species, but it really microhabitats are something that easily is swept under the rug and overlooked, doesn't it?
yep.
It's even challenging to accomplish in your enclosures too, especially with like species that need high humidity. So I do have a question too, because I want to make sure I have a good understanding. How do you define natural history, especially when you're narrowing it down to a species to species basis? Like, what does that constitute? Like, how do you apply that definition?
So when I think about how natural history, like the defining natural history per helmeted geckos. I'm thinking, where historically have helmeted geckos been found? Sometimes you'll get lucky and there's material out there that actually that goes back a decent amount of time. Usually what it means is, we've got point maps of where that species is found. It means, what topography, like what's the climatology, the geography of that region, what's it been historically as well as in the modern day. I suppose it goes kind of hand in hand of just like naturalistic husbandry in general, of like really just sort of replicating that natural region, the region that animal's endemic to.
I think it's kind of poetic when you, like, now that I have a better understanding, I think it is honestly poetic when I apply it to like the work you do specifically, especially with the blue tree monitors. Like when you have species that are over trafficked, over exported, or face deforestation, when they no longer have a habitat for you to reference back to. You are literally going back to look at the natural history, that information that is archived effectively,
Yeah,
and applying that to captivity.
yeah, and that's a great point too about like deforestation and stuff, and it's also kind of why I apply that natural history term to it, because we have been active in these animals' native regions for, at this industrial scale, maybe like 100 years or so. But they've been doing their own thing in those regions for thousands, millions of years.
Mm-hmm.
So when you go and look at like an island in Indonesia today, and it's like stripped of all its trees and stuff, that's obviously not what a lot of these species need,
Mm-hmm.
in order to survive. So being able to reach back as far as you can, like past the point of like human interference with the regions, and really get a good sense of what did that land look like that produced that animal? What did they find in those regions back before we came around to survive and thrive and reproduce?
So, do you have experiences of kind of like, you mentioned your previous work with like the helmet-headed geckos? So I guess I want to ask if you can elaborate on that. Do you have a side-by-side comparison of keeping reptiles one way that is basically medial, keeping them generally how they should be kept, basically meeting all their needs, and then going the extra steps further and say somewhat mimicking seasons, or
Mhm.
really dialing in their exposure to temperatures or ultraviolet? Like, can you like say there's a night and day difference, or with
Oh
some
yeah.
species maybe not?
Because when we talk about like that bottom up husbandry, um, you know, when I got a handle on that project specifically, the helmeted geckos, they were being kept in racks. Like a lot of other breeding facilities will keep like leopard geckos in that at scale. Um, and yeah, they were alive. They were, their body conditions were good, but they weren't doing anything for them. And when I really went and overhauled the project and got things set up in terrariums with access to um, different resources. One of the big ones I can point to actually is how we talk about heat. It's a big part of why lighting's another really big particular interest of mine, is because we talk about thermoregulation with reptiles. If we're applying a natural history standpoint, thermoregulation comes from the sun. Like basically, I can't really think of a reptile that doesn't get its heat from the sun in some way, shape, or form. Like even if they're like in a log or underneath leaf litter or something like that, and they find a pocket of like warmer dirt, that dirt is warmer because the sun is able to heat that dirt more so than it can like surrounding dirt. So
Mhm.
like if we talk about providing thermal gradients for reptiles, we talk about that bottom up husbandry. Well, I can just provide like heat tape or a heat mat or something, right? And it gets the reptile warm. But we're really not getting a good grasp in that aspect of like, no, in the wild, these creatures get their heat from the sun. What is the sun doing that gets that reptile warm? It's providing that infrared A. And with the helmeted geckos, one of the first things that they were doing when they first got put in those terrariums is, I went and set up a basking array like you would for a bearded dragon. It's got like a halogen incandescent bulb in there for good infrared. It's got a UV strip, some LEDs. They would sit during the middle of the day. A nocturnal crepuscular reptile would sit directly right on top, right underneath the basking bulb. I've got a photo of it that I wish I could pull up right now, but you know, and that was one of those like kind of light bulb moments for me. I had a feeling that it was going to have like a really good effect, but that gecko, especially since A, it's a prey animal, it doesn't want to be visible if it doesn't need to be. B, it's nocturnal, so it's only going to be active during the day. Um, Providing that basking site for that kind of a critter and it immediately going, and after spending a really large amount of time in a shoebox, you go and you put it in a terrarium with that really good thermal gradient, and it immediately goes and uses it, because even though it's been kept a certain way for so long, there's still things about that basking site that that animal knows just habitually how to use. Like that helmeted gecko knows, per the UV intensity at this area, per the light intensity. This is about how warm I'm going to be getting. Obviously, if I get too warm, I'm probably going to go crawl into the underneath the little humid microclimate area that I've got set up in a different spot of the enclosure.
Right.
But
They're
again,
they're really
these
efficient
animals
at.
are built innately to know how to use natural
Right.
systems.
That's what I was gonna say. Yeah, they're very good at self-regulating. That
Yeah, and we say that, and again, kind of going back to that heating thing of like people not understanding, well, why do I need to give it all of this when I can just give it a heat mat? And it's like, well, again, when I go and I give that reptile that basking site, and it immediately goes and knows how to use it, even though it hasn't been exposed to it in maybe its entire life, or at least until the last time it was like outside in the wild, if it was wild collected. Like, to me, that says something. I learn a lot by reptiles, honestly, just by observing where they are in the enclosure and what they're using and how often.
what would you say to the people that work with very well established species, like for example, ball pythons, where they're of the belief that the animals have to be in racks. They do better in racks. Maybe their specific animals do better in racks. How would you go about to encourage a keeper
Yeah.
to lean away from that if they wanted to?
Well, that kind of goes back again to what is. So we say that a ball python needs to be in a rack because they like to be in burrows and they like to feel secure, right? It's like, well, out in Africa, right? What is a ball? It's like, what does that mean specifically? Because like a lot of times you'll hear a lot of isms like that, especially for really well established animals that like people have been doing it a certain way for so long, where it's like they need this because XYZ. And it's like they obviously don't have access to that sort of a system out where they came from, but they still reproduce. They still managed to sustain a population in the wild for so long. So what are they doing out in Africa that they are getting access to that resource? If we're talking about the animal needing to have a space that they feel secure in, well, we're talking basically about a hide. If we're talking about, I need to keep this animal in a rack because I need to keep humidity better. It's like, well, we're talking then about humidity regulation in their system. Just because this one system has produced animals that survive for so long doesn't necessarily mean that um, we're
Did we lose
approaching it in
Brandon?
a way that the animal is most well equipped
There
to
you
survive.
go. Okay, yeah, I guess that makes like in a way, like even a rack system is kind of achieving part of their husbandry, like the burrows technically, but there's still a lot of important aspects you're missing, arguably, like the light exposure, that enrichment, I guess you could say. I don't know. I don't work with snakes or colubrids,
Mhm.
boas, so I can't say for certain how they react in a rack versus an enclosure. And I won't apply my personal tendencies to everyone. I do have a follow up question too pertaining to research. Like when it comes to digging up natural history, how what would you advise someone to start with so that they're not overwhelmed?
Again, a really good thing to start with is literally just figuring out where they come from. iNaturalist, honestly, if you're a beginner, is a premium starting point because not only does it provide you that point map, it will also often provide you photo. Like people will take a photograph of I found this ball python here, and you can see exactly like where that ball python is and what's around it, right? So if I go and find one in like a savanna field, and there's like a termite mound nearby or like a shrub that the ball python is in. Well, you've learned a bunch of things right there. We've learned that a savanna type system is something that they're able to survive in. We've learned that they're doing something to interact with termite mounds. We've learned that they occasionally like to climb. All three of those things have been documented with ball pythons in the wild. So, like, and sometimes people in those, you got to learn how to parse information out too. Like, I want to go and find information about ball pythons, and I'll find some people that have seen them in Africa, and then some people have seen them in Florida. Obviously, they did not come from Florida, and that's kind of where we go back to that natural history standpoint, right? Where like we know whereabouts, like people will say like, yeah, we collected this species from over here, this is whereabouts the area that they're from. So
Yeah, that was a question I was considering asking you, but it was more of a for giggles question. Like if there is a species that has become invasive in another country or state, would someone technically be wrong for using the invasive state as their reference point for natural history?
yeah, that's kind of an interesting thought experiment. Clearly that region is providing them something that they're able to use and reproduce in. um, One of the big questions there is how long is that sustainable for that species? We've been collecting animals from the wild for about 60 to 80 years. So for a lot of those invasives, and maybe some of them have been introduced like even like sooner, like earlier than then by like shipping routes and that sort of thing. But per human activity, invasives haven't been in that region for terribly long. So it may have been conducive for a few generations for that animal to survive. And, especially some of them become particularly injurious. And really start to overpopulate an area. But again, how long is that going to be the case for that species? So it's definitely relevant information, I'd say. It's information that, like, if I'm looking at a particular species and um, like the region, let's say it's again going back to Africa. There's a bunch of different biozones in Africa. We've got deserts, we've got rainforests, we've got savanna types. And then let's say that we have a species that's found in a very large portion of those. You know, we find some in the savanna, some in the rainforest, some in like a coastal region. And then we go over to another area that the animal is invasive in. And that region is like that one's got mountains, it's got temperate forests, and it's got rainforests. So maybe we learned that through that invasive population, maybe there's something about rainforest biomes that are particularly conducive to that species survival. So there's some, like, you know, those sorts of invasive populations, it's definitely information that's worth taking into account, in my opinion. I wouldn't obviously base the entirety of my husbandry off of that, obviously, but like I said, it is useful. Like, all information is useful information.
Right. It kind of comes full circle. Like it shows the adaptability and the compatibility the animal has, either genetically or environmentally, and then it comes full circle by doing a comparison of the true natural history to determine if this is what's best for that species.
Mm-hmm.
So that does bring up another question that I kind of asked earlier, but I want to, if you're willing to dive into it a little bit more. When it comes to picking and choosing aspects of the natural environment and the natural history, where like what do you have examples and reasoning for things you would omit from the natural history in replication of the enclosure?
Well, so there are some obvious ones. Like if you go to a rainforest biome, something you'll find in particular abundance are like fruit flies, mosquitoes, other pest insects. It's fairly safe to say that we don't want those in our enclosure. And another, obviously, you know, mites are another big one that are found in abundance in the native region of these animals. Obviously, I don't want snake mites in my ball python enclosure. Um, so there's some no brainer ones like that where it's like this is clearly going to be something that is going to negatively affect the animal's health. I should omit that information. Um,
Mm.
and a lot of that can be informed by experience, the body of experience that we have working with other reptile species. You know, kind of getting into the nitty gritty of learning how to take care of a new species. At the same day, like, even if we haven't worked with a particular species of gecko in captivity before, we still know that it's a gecko. There are still a lot of things that we know how, like, what geckos are doing and what they
Mm.
need. So there are some things you might find, you know, when you're taking a picture of a gecko out in the wild and there's like a pile of trash nearby it. That's probably not something that we want to put in our enclosures.
Cause
But
some distress.
yeah, but like I said, we can cross compare with a lot of this with the body of knowledge that we have of those creatures like succeeding in captivity and being like we know what does and doesn't work at a basic level. So if something we were finding in that region, we know for a fact isn't going to result in something that's positive or enriching, then we can probably omit that information.
Mm. No, that makes sense. Because like I've seen, I don't think I've seen any completely outrageous, like, oh, that's not natural remarks. I think the most outlandish would be people's qualms with like using plates or bowls for food and water. Like they don't get those in the wild, is what people say. Like, but then again, technically supplementing our animals is technically also unnatural. So it's like there's
Yeah.
a divide of like of the human intervention and your duty as a keeper and your responsibility and what you have to do to make sure your animal stays
Yep.
healthy because of the things they do lose in captivity while still
That's,
making it as naturalistic as possible. Like,
yeah, and that's kind of where we go back to that top-down husbandry of like I'm figuring out what I'm getting that good picture of what does that native region for that animal look like, and then I'm bringing that back down to a level that's conducive and will provide a suitable environment for that animal to thrive in captivity.
okay.
So, like you said, we're not dusting insects. There's nothing running around dusting the insects out in the middle of the rainforest. It is also true that that dust is making up for something that's lacking in captive insects where they're being found in natural insects.
Yeah, it's really the understanding the hobby possesses is really surface level. Like there's a lot underneath the surface that can get quite complex, especially lighting.
Hmm.
Lighting is not as simple as it is introduced very nonchalantly.
Lighting's one of those things for me where it's simultaneously the baseline concept for how I approach lighting is pretty simple in that I'm looking to replicate natural sunlight. Um, what that means, what I need to do that, and what actually benefits the animal that I'm keeping, that's where it gets really complex.
Okay. I think that's fair. I think I'm out of questions for now, but I do have ideas for a part two if you're ever interested, and maybe we can go over like
Mhm.
how like the actual logistics of applying some of this knowledge to an enclosure. Like we can come up with some species examples. But before we do wrap up, we did have one question. Someone was asking about leopard geckos. So I guess do you have any of examples of how you would apply natural history for a leopard gecko?
Oh, for leopard gecko, yeah. One of the big ones for them, for me, was uh, I did a decent amount of digging at one point into tailoring substrate mixes for different species. That's one of the things too that varies a lot based on where you might be. And like soil content is something that is also very well documented. It's pretty important for agriculture that we know how soils work in various regions. So I actually went at one point and cross compared like wild leopard gecko populations to a soil map of Iran and Pakistan where they're from. And we learned that they're primarily found in like rocky loam soil, which was really interesting to me, especially when we were talking about certain other aspects of like how do we choose an appropriate substrate for a leopard gecko. Like it might sound a little bit counterintuitive of like that sounds like it's a potential risk for the animal. um, but it was certainly a species again that as a part of that process that I did kind of cross compare that and found that particularly interesting. There's also a few studies now too on wild leopard geckos and how a lot of them are found in communities. And like you'll go and turn over like go into a cave that's got a leopard gecko in it, but what it actually has is like several males, females, and babies. Obviously, that doesn't mean that we should start. Cohabitation is an entire other discussion to have, but and that's kind of where we get into we know like keeping male leopard geckos in captivity is a bad idea. So maybe we discount that information, right? But
Yeah, that you would have to tread carefully with that, I think. What would your advice be for someone who came across natural history, something cited, scientifically documented, or just like something verifiable and trackable, but no one has stumbled upon in their own research, and it has led to a corner of the community holding a certain opinion that, like you said, is counterintuitive, but like data shows that like this is what they have in the wild. Like, how would you advise someone that wants to stick to their guns, basically?
um, so we go back to finding a bit of information about leopard geckos occupying like communal hide systems in nature, right? And we know we've well established in herpetoculture that there are issues that arise from cohabitating leopard geckos. Um, so,
Like,
in
safety is
terms,
paramount too.
uh,
Safety is paramount too, like risking an
exactly,
animal.
yep. So when we talk about, you found this new piece of information that hasn't been really well versed in the community, especially if you're a hobbyist, really finding those top shelf community members. Like we go into the reptile lighting scene, and there's probably a couple of names that come immediately to both of our minds of like, there's a lot of people. There's a lot of people that have a lot of opinions, but I really trust like this particular person's opinion. Really going to those verifiable sources and being like, "What's your thoughts on this?" You might get some novel takes that the general community might not immediately give you.
Mm. Yeah, so basically just because someone has a loud opinion doesn't mean it's the correct opinion, but also throwing three sheets to the wind may not be the best practice either without a full understanding and a contingency plan,
Yeah.
basically.
At the end of the day, herpetoculture in of itself is a science, and our understanding of science is ever changing.
Hmm.
So I feel like that's something that a lot of people struggle with when they get into herpetoculture and talking about like naturalistic husbandry and that, and people having their takes on, well, I've been keeping my animals like this for so long, yada yada.
Hmm.
Um,
Why change what
we
works? I've seen that a lot.
Yeah, we have understood that this animal survives in this sort of system for so long, but we talk about like the rack system thing again, and we have studies of actual neural atrophy from being kept in like aggressively reduced rack systems. We've got that evidence now that shows, hey, maybe there's an issue with this that we haven't been talking about before.
Hmm.
So again, it's a science, it's ever changing, it's something that people always debate over as well.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
it's important to recognize that. I wouldn't, when I'm like basing my husbandry off of natural history, I'm probably going and not implementing information that's like very new or hotly debated. We can all agree that a ball python needs pretty high humidity, so that's something that I can implement from their native range. Versus, like, again, that cohabitation thing, it's a new piece of information. It's been documented. There's something going on with it. We might not necessarily inherently understand how that works and why it works. So until we have that information, maybe that's something that's best left off the table for the time being.
Right. No, I agree with that completely. I think there might be some hurdles some people have to to get over in terms of interpreting what they learn when it comes to their research or someone else's research into natural history. Like there are limitations to what we can offer, and there are extensions we can take to apply this information, maybe. But until studies have done and we have a lot more people doing it, figuring out the best way, and then you have to factor in that maybe some individuals are not as willing as others for example with like cohabitation maybe. But yeah, no, so it's you raise an excellent point by saying that it is a science and it is constantly evolving. It is constantly being unearthed, like what we know, what we thought.
I do
So I
want to
think
say I'm not saying to go cohabitate your leopard geckos necessarily.
yeah, no, yeah, no. I think what you did say it yourself that just because we see this in the wild, maybe wait until we have a better understanding of what's happening. I think that was very well understood.
Hmm.
um, so
You
then I
just got to
guess
throw it out there.
yeah, yeah, no, just yeah, there are still a lot of pros that we can gain by naturalistic keeping and following naturalistic history, but there are still limitations to what we can achieve in captivity, and that will change whether on an environmental enclosure basis or an individual animal basis. So it's like you have to know your animal, you have to know how to read your animal, see its response, gauge what it needs, like by what you said about watching where they're basking, where they spend their time in the enclosure.
It's a
That's
big thing too of like we can learn so much about a species at large, and then you get an animal that you know we talk about humans having drastically different needs because we're all individual people. That doesn't change with lizards. They're all very different critters too. Um, if you keep like a bunch of the same species, it's something that you can definitely observe of like they, especially if you go and set them all up the same way, a bunch of them will use their enclosures differently and they're telling you different things.
yeah, no, that's an excellent point. Like there's always an exception, but there is still a baseline generally, and that would be what the animal needs, how it's genetically predisposed, like how it processes different things, vitamins, etc. List goes on. But so if people had questions or they wanted to have their own topic of debate or ask your advice on something, what would be the best way for people to contact you if you're open to that?
Yeah, I go by the same name on Facebook, Instagram. If people, I'm perfectly happy to accept DMs. If people like want to debate in a more public forum, I'm very comfortable with having discussions with people in various different formats. Like I said, DMs, like adding me in posts, even I'll answer.
Okay. Okay, well, do you have anything else
Facebook
you
and
wanted to
Instagram
add?
are probably my main two that I would
What is the
want to.
Instagram?
Huh?
What is the Instagram?
Uh, it's BRANC.
B Rancy. Okay. All right. Did you have anything else you wanted to add? Talk about your Blue Tree Monitor project? Any passion projects, or do you want to hold out on that?
uh, yeah, I don't really have much else to add at the moment.
Okay, that's fair. That's all right. Okay. Well, then we'll end it here.
Cool.
All right.
Thank you for having me.
Mm-hmm.